Hello again. So in the previous video we improved our graph structure and now we are going to see the graph testing. While programming, it's always desirable to have some kind of test-driven development. And the way our app is structured with the graph lib splitted from the backend, so we can test it independently. And this has a lot of advantages because we can isolate the graph functionalities, and I don't know, maybe in the future we can even change our backend to not use Express, to use AWS API Gateway, or we can do the opposite. We can change our database to not use graph anymore, and the HTTP server and the database, the graph database code will be decoupled. Let's get started. To test our Neo4j graph, we are going to use this package called test containers, which provide us many types of instances. Those instances are ephemeral and they run on top of Docker. Let's go to our VS Code. I forgot to commit our previous chapter about the graph structure. I will do that right now. And let's run our application, just to check that the API and the web services are running. Let's go to our browser and let's check that our API is working correctly. I'm going to move this window to this other monitor, and I'm going to split this terminal here to make more room to the right terminal. First step, we need to install some required packets. In the development mode, test containers and jest extended. Let's wait a little bit while the packets are being installed. All right, let's clear the terminal, and the test containers, every time that we run a test, it will create a Docker instance with some, of course, some authentication. And we are going to save those information in a file, and we need to ensure that this file will not be commit to Git. So echo, we are going to add this Neo4j config JSON. We are going to add it to our git ignore. All right, and now let's create this file. It will be inside our graph, and we are going to create a new folder inside source, new folder, and the file name will be Neo4j config file.ts. We are going to use this file to store the test containers authentication information. Let's import everything as fs from fs, so we can use file system from Node. And we are going to export the type Neo4j container config will be equal to something with a URL, which is a string, username, another string, and passwords, another string. Right? And our function const Neo4j config file will receive a file name, and by default it will be Neo4j container config.json, and this will return two methods to interact with the file. One is to read the file. It will be an async, and it will return a promise, and the format will be a Neo4j container config, and what we need to const Neo4j container config file be equal to file system dot read file sync with the file name. And the return will see JSON parse Neo4j container config file and to string. Now another method to write the file. It will receive a Neo4j container config with the format of Neo4j container config, and it will use file system write file sync file name, and with JSON.stringify Neo4j container config null, and with 2 spaces of indentation. I'm missing a comma here. Basically, this helper will be responsible to read and to write the configuration file used by test containers. Next step, every time that we run a test, the test will need to connect to the Neo4j. We already have middleware in the API level, but here we are not going to use the API, the Express API. So we need to create a function that will connect to Neo4j. And we are going to call it a Neo4j driver.ts. And we need to import Neo4j and driver from Neo4j driver. And we need to import Neo4j container config, the format that the configuration file will have for Neo4j config file. Alright, and let's export our const Neo4j driver equal to an async, and we'll receive the parameters URL, the username, and the password. And those parameters will be using the Neo4j container config format. And this will return a promise with our driver. Alright, and first we need to set the authentication, so neo4j.auth basic using the username and the password. And the driver will be equal to neo4j.driver, and we are going to pass the URL, the authentication, and here we need to customize the Neo4j to disable lossless integers and make it compatible with JavaScript. And let's return the driver. Alright, I believe it's correct. Let's set up Jest. Jest already came installed with our NX application, but we will need to add some customizations. Right? So inside the graph, let's open jestconfig.ts, and we need to add 2 more lines, 2 more properties here. One is setup files after env. We need to add an array here with jest extended /all, and we need to set the global setup for jest inside this graph package. So it will be jest global setup.ts. Jest global setup will be responsible for start test containers or check if we already have a test container Docker instance running, and if there is an instance already running, we are going to use that same instance. This will save us time between tests. We don't need to recreate the Neo4j instance. Alright, and now in the graph, let's create a new file, and it will be called just global setup.ts. In this file, we are going to import a Neo4j container and started a Neo4j container from test containers. Neo4j container. What's wrong here? Container. All right. And we need to import Neo4j driver from our source utils / Neo4j driver. And finally, we need to import Neo4j config file. Our setup will be equal to an async function that will return a promise void, and let's do the function. Let container will be equal to started a Neo4j container or undefined equal undefined and the column. Okay, let's use a try catch. We are going to try to read our Neo4j config, which will be equal to await a Neo4j config file and read. We are going to try to read the configuration file, and from the configuration file we are going to start a Neo4j driver with the same configuration, Neo4j config. And with the driver, we are going to try to get the server info. Await driver dot get server info. And finally, console log. And in case of success, we are going to output Neo4j container found at, let's use our server info dot address. Okay, this is the first situation where the Neo4j instance is already running. If not, we are going to output console log, and let's use info here, it would be better. And a string literal here. We are going to add a new line and say to that Neo4j container is being created because it was not found. So using test containers, how to create a new Neo4j container will be equal to await Neo4j container dot with reuse with APOC, because we are using some APOC functionalities, and let's start the container. Finally, let's await Neo4j config file to write the configuration file using the properties we can get from the container we just created. So URL, username, container get username, and finally password will be equal to container dot get passwords. Okay, right, and finally export setup. So this file, this setup will be triggered every time that we start test routine using Jest. It will basically check if existing test container is running, and if not, it's going to create another one. All right, we are going to create a helper function here because we are going to have some hard-coded sample movies with hard-coded IDs that we are going to use to insert into the database. And if like we insert a new movie called Top Gun with ID 1, and of course Neo4j is going to create another ID to it, but we need to compare if the Top Gun that we have in the sample will be the same of the Top Gun that was inserted in the database. But of course their IDs will be different, so this helper basically will remove IDs from the records. Alright, let's do it inside utils, and new file, it will be called ignore ID. And I'm going to copy this method here. Alright, and let's close. And let's create some sample data to the movies. And we are going to do that inside shared, source, and let's create another folder here, call it sample data, and a new file called movies.ts. We are going to import the movie from types, and types movie, and export const movies will be equal, it will be an array of movies of course, and it will be equal some sample data that I will copy from the wiki. So we have two movies here. One is the Shawshank Redemption and the other one is the Godfather, right? And initially those movies, they have their title, their released year, and their taglines. We have two movies. And let's keep in that pattern, let's create a new file here, index.ts, to export everything from movies. And all right, also we need to expose our sample data using this index file from shared. So sample data will be available to other packages as well. Finally, let's create our test case. Inside graph, source, movies, we have index.ts with all the methods to interact with movies. And let's create another file here. It will be called index.spec.ts. Right? And here we need to import driver and session from Neo4j driver. We need to import movie and the movies as sample movies from our shared library. And we are going to import our queries as graph from here. Actually, we are not importing the queries, we are importing the graph movies methods. And what's next? We need to import Neo4j driver from our utils, and a lot of things to be imported. Neo4j config file and the Neo4j container config from utils, Neo4j config file. What's wrong here, please? Okay, capital N. Okay, and let's import our helper function ignore ID from ignore ID. Before our test case, let's create another helper here, specific to be used inside this test case. So expect movies to be equal movie 1, it will be a movie, and movie 2, it will be a movie as well. And const movie 1 posts will be equal to ignore ID movie 1. and const movie to parsed will be equal to ignore id movie 2. Alright, so movie 1 and movie 2 parsed versions will be ignoring their IDs. Expect the movie 1 parsed dot title to equal movie 2 parsed title, and the same thing for their tagline and released. This helper function here basically compares two movies to be sure they are equal. Our tests describe, and it will testing graph movies, and inside it will just set timeout to this value. Let Neo4j config, it will be a Neo4j container config. Let driver will be a Neo4j driver, of course, and session should be a Neo4j session. And our sample movie, we are going to extract the first one. It will be the sample movies first records. We are going to create another helper inside our description, so clear data base will be equal to async function, and this will await session.run, and here we are going to run a cipher query to remove all the data, detach, delete, and it will basically remove all the data in the Neo4j. This will be necessary because we are trying to reuse the Neo4j test container instance without restarting it or to save time between tests. Alright, and before all, async and Neo4j config will be equal to await Neo4j config file read, and driver will be equal to Neo4j driver with the configuration we grabbed from config, and session will be equal to the driver dot session. After that, let's clear the database. And after all the tests, after all, let's async await session.close and await driver.close. Of course, before all our tests, we need to start the Neo4j test container. And after all, we are going to close the session. We are going to keep the container because this container could be useful to run additional tests. Let's insert two tests. So it should create a movie. We need to test if the movie is being created. So const movie will be equal to await graph dot movies. We are going to pass the session that we have and create the sample movie. We are going to use that helper expected movies to be equal, so the movie we just created needs to be equal to the sample movie. All right, and another test should get the previously created movie, and this const movie, we are going to extract the first move we are going to get from await graph dot movies dot with the session dot get all, and we are going to filter to retrieve only the sample move.title. So again, expected movies to be equal movie and sample movie. Now finally let's mark some to do here. In the next step we need to test that update movie tagline is working, and we need to test that delete the movie is also working. Alright. Here there is some error. I missed an async here, and the code looks good. Let's run it. To run the test, we are going to use nx test graph and hit enter. Let's make it bigger. The Neo4j container is being created and the two tests passed. And that's great because let's say in the future we need to update some query, okay? And so to update some query, we go to movie queries, and maybe we need to make some change here in the get all right? And for some reason we change it to the tagline here. We commit a mistake and we are going to save it. And let's run the test again. Wait a while, and the test failed because our query is incorrect. And with this test-driven approach, we can easily see that we commit a mistake, and we can easily correct them and check again if our code is correct. And NX even provides us with some cache optimization to make the tests very fast. Finally, we can use, of course, the watch attribute here, the flag watch, and we can check in real time if our queries are correct or not. I changed the query here again, and now I'm going to fix it. Okay, and another advantage of the structure that we just created, the graph is completely decoupled from our API, so the test cases are running very fast and independently of the API. I hope you enjoy it, and let's continue in the next videos building our graph CRUD. Alright, bye bye.